Today's guest is Ahmed Eldin, journalist, documentary filmmaker.
At Meta or Instagram, there's just really no explanation for the double standard. If you say Palestinians should be free from the river to the sea, you're inciting violence, but we're going to change your hate speech policies so that I can call for the assassination of Russian people, and that's all good. Almost at every major media company that I worked, there was overt censorship. I have no regrets that I spoke very boldly and bluntly about apartheid and the occupation in Israel at a young age, ended up losing really incredible opportunities or platforms because I'm critical of Israel.
If you do commit your entire life to this, then you also have to pay your bills. So then there becomes this notion of, I am doing what I love, but at the same time, I'm conflicted because I also need to do what makes money.
And that's why we do have to take an ad break. This ad is brought to you by the Russian government, okay? They're not doing well.
Hello and welcome to episode 49 of the Palestine Pod, the weekly podcast where we break down the latest headlines dealing with Palestine from all over the world and bring you stories, commentary, and interviews with the aim of supporting the Palestinian struggle for justice and equal rights. I'm one of your hosts, Lara E. You might know me from Instagram as @GazanGirl, and I'm joined by my co-host, Mikey B.
What's up, y'all? Mikey B on TikTok, Michael Schertzer on Instagram, and you can call me Mikey Intifada if you've been screaming for sanctions against Russia, but you still mad about Ben and Jerry's.
Yeah. So before we get into today's episode, please like, comment, and subscribe if you hang out with us on YouTube. If you're listening on a podcast app, subscribe and leave a review. As always, you can find our full episodes and sources on PalestinePod.com. And if you want to get involved in the conversation, feel free to reach out to us at PalestinePod@gmail.com and give us a follow on Instagram @ThePalestinePod. We're also going strong on Patreon, so if you love the Palestine Pod and you want to support this project, join our Patreon, where you get early access to the Palestine Pod episodes and an additional 1 to 2 podcasts per week, including our latest creation, the Patreon Pod. It's a little more laid back. We talk politics, pop culture, and get a little more personal with Michael and myself. We're also hosting our monthly Zoom happy hours for our Patreon subscribers only, so really exciting stuff. Check us out on patreon.com/PalestinePod. Today's guest is Ahmed Eldin. Ahmed is a journalist, documentary filmmaker, producer, and you may have recognized him as a GQ cover model. Ahmed, welcome to the Palestine Pod.
Thanks. It feels like home.
That's great. That's like probably the coolest thing anyone said, joining us.
Totally.
No, really, it does. It feels great. Happy to be here.
It also is your home, right? Behind you.
Yeah, exactly.
It's pretty good stuff.
So, Ahmed, you're super, I don't want to call you, I mean, you do so many things and I don't want to, but you have also a very active presence on social media. And I share so much of your stuff. How do you find the time to be everywhere? I mean, what is it like? What are your projects right now, and how does social media fit into that?
That's a great question. A little too self-reflective. Now I'm going to have to make drastic life changes. People ask me that sometimes, like, how are you everywhere on this issue and that issue? And I really feel the opposite. I have been lucky to not be doing the 9-to-5 grind for a while now because of COVID. And so I'm learning how to manage my time better. But yeah, I'm working full time sort of on a investigative doc. It's been 1.5 years and it's been really time consuming, but then it's in chunks. So yeah, I feel like sometimes what happens, to answer your question more aptly, is that something happens in the world somewhere and I just get very fixated on it because it has some sort of compelling or very engaging, not just because it's like, a war or some sort of thing that demands your attention, but, when things pluck at my heartstrings, like it's hard to not become a little too voluble. Like I talk too much sometimes. And it's dangerous when you have all these apps that you can just talk into.
Yeah. So you're working on a documentary. Can you share a little bit more what it's about?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So I'm working on a documentary, which is kind of like my main thing. It's going to end in a couple months. It's in the region. It's in the Arab world. And it's about a marginalized community. I'm being intentionally vague, mostly for security reasons, quite frankly, because it's pretty dangerous work that we're doing. I don't know if dangerous is the right word. That makes me sound like some, it's just very sensitive work. And I want to make sure I don't jeopardize anybody's livelihood or well-being. But yeah, it's about a marginalized community, surprise, surprise, people who are misrepresented, who are demonized, who are often spoken about but not given a voice. And it's not just about them in general, it's just we found some incredible characters that really bring to light this community in a way that I think hopefully will be super impactful. It's a project that will end, and other than that, I've been doing a lot of kind of more personal things, like working on writing a memoir.
Oh, wow.
I know it sounds very like, I'm writing a memoir all about me. Whenever I bring it up, it's not a memoir as much as it's like a manifesto based on my life. On my life.
I don't know that manifesto is the better word. You know, I feel like memoir is manifesto makes it sounds like you got a vendetta. Political. You know, like someone's gonna pay.
I do, but it's against. I think I'm gonna pay. I think it's a vendetta against myself. No, it's just post-COVID. I think it's been really easy. A lot easier for a lot of us to kind of take stock of like our lives and you know the way we live them and our choices. So it's just an opportunity to reflect. Maybe it'll never get published, but it's been a really fun process.
Are you self-producing or are you working with a network or anything on the documentary?
No, so yeah, this doc is actually with a big kind of major broadcaster, so it might get a lot of eyes, but I'm working as a contractor. Like it's not a full-time job, which has been really a blessing in disguise the last few years. I've learned that even though it comes with a lot of like sacrifice, it's sometimes really empowering to be kind of in charge, more in charge of your voice, whatever you do.
Well, because you started out, I mean, for a while people saw you with Al Jazeera, right? And you've been attached to other networks as well. Yeah. And so now you're, it seems like you're kind of like trying to like pave your own way and your own sort of identity without that.
Yeah. I don't even know that it's going to be mostly in the traditional journalistic role. What's been really exciting to me really is just exploring new things. I won't claim that like I've found like a new career path, but I've definitely found things that entertain me and engage me and inspire me, and that I'm kind of going to stick to for a while and see what happens.
And the Ahmed Eldin podcast, where's that at?
I
heard you were starting a podcast.
No, that's why I told you it's incredible that you've done 50 episodes in a year.
This is also not my day job, so it's like there's that too.
Yeah,
I have a 9 to 5. Like it's like
she was like, you may think it's impressive, but it's actually more impressive than you think. Okay, I've actually been doing way more than just what you know about.
I'll be honest. Like I think that's a real testament to. I mean, I could have asked you the same question. Like I see you tweet everywhere. You have a whole like responsibility in your personal life that I think I don't have.
Part of the answer is that Michael is really good at maintaining our social media presence, and he doesn't have a day job. He has a night job as working as a comedian. So I'm very blessed to be with a co-host that invests as much time as he does into this project, because it is a passion project. It's not, this is not profitable. Like I always say, we're bleeding cash. We're bleeding cash.
No, but that's I think that's all the more noble. I mean, just to answer your question, the podcast turned into 3 different podcasts, and I recorded this incredible content. A lot of it Palestine-related or focused, with Jordan Assad and like all these really kind of these people with very complicated relationships to Israel and Palestine. Mm-hmm. And I just chose not to. I think I want to use the excuse of perfectionist, but maybe a lack of conviction and focus made me want to press the brakes.
Okay, so we're never going to see that.
No, but there'll be another version. I'm really serious when I say I'm inspired by people like you who say it's not about the money, but you're just doing it because it is a passion project and it's obviously something you enjoy, or you wouldn't be doing it, I'm assuming.
Sure. Well, I mean, there's also a luxury in that too, right? Journalism isn't my day job, so I can make this a passion project. I think that's where it gets tricky, because if you do commit your entire life to this, then you also have to pay your bills. So then there becomes this notion of, I am doing what I love, but at the same time, I'm conflicted because I also need to do what makes money through what I love. Well, and then it's really tricky, because then you pick projects based on what earns, right?
Yeah. And that's why we do actually have to take an ad break. This ad is brought to you by the Russian government. Okay. They're not doing well.
No. Yeah. I don't know what to say other than I think it's amazing when people talk about this, let alone any podcast, but this issue, because I think it also does, at least in my field, come with a cost inherently baked in.
Of course.
You know, there are many times in my career, I think, where I chose relative to then, like now the terminology that I use, and I think the way in which I speak about this issue is maybe more bold or more blunt than it's ever been.
I've totally noticed that. I've totally
yeah. And,
Yeah.
and I'm not going to lie about the fact that doesn't mean that I was consciously censoring myself before, but I think it was just a realistic balance in terms of being able to actually have a foot in the door and to have a microphone, because back then, if you use certain terms that now at least we're sort of kind of allowed to use, you'd be written off of any sort of media endorsed platform. And yeah, so you know all about it.
So yeah, let's explore that a little bit further. I mean, how do you feel that the language has developed? What do you feel like you're able to say now? And you know, maybe you can also, if you think of something, recall sort of instances where you were sort of I don't want to say required, but instances where you chose to narrate a story in a different way, and
yeah,
where today possibly if you had to retell the story, you would have done so from a different angle or using different words.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think the conversation has shifted dramatically in the Western world, specifically in the US. I say dramatically not to suggest it's shifted a whole bunch, but it's shifted in a dramatic way. I say that because there was a time not so long ago at the beginning of my career, I was working at the New York Times and other sort of like even PBS and other places where even the term occupation was not just controversial, but oftentimes not tolerated, erased. And I think the visibility that we've seen thanks to social media, even despite the censorship, but like the Al-Kurd twins and so many other young Palestinians, my age and younger, but I want to focus on the young ones, because they, I think, really, through the intersectional resistance, through the Black Lives Matter sort of solidarity and beyond, even the Me Too movement, the perception that minorities and marginalized people were being attacked, I think was an opportunity for a lot of people to kind of brush up on, you know, beyond the woke sort of, you know, moment, if you will. And I just noticed that terms started shifting. And when I saw sort of some people be very brave, and after having maybe been out of the media world for a while, I have no regrets that I spoke maybe very boldly and bluntly about apartheid and the occupation in Israel at a young age, as an opinion writer, as a journalist, on TV, as an anchor in many facilities, on stages, at panels. And I think that drew attention to me in a positive sense in some ways, but it definitely drew a lot of negativity. But I never avoided speaking the truth. I think consciously, I think what it was is there was just, as I said, an awareness of where the lines were. But yeah, I definitely flirted around those lines. And as I mentioned, like with CNN and other big companies, ended up losing really incredible opportunities or platforms because I'm critical of Israel. But these terms, like ethnic displacement, ethnic cleansing, apartheid, those were not anywhere on the table, even in the human rights constructs and spaces. If they were used, they were very polarizing. And yeah, I think you're seeing a whole generation of Americans and beyond. It's sad that I wouldn't say the same about the Arab world. That's a whole nother conversation. But definitely in the US, with how polarized things are, and for so many reasons, like I said, it's been really refreshing to see the shift take place. And just the way in which people are recognizing and calling out double standards. I've seen it in your content. I think it's just, Rashida Tlaib, like there's so many different factors. I think visibility is so important. That's why it's like, you know, I'm a journalist. I happen to be originally Palestinian, but you're starting to see people speak out about Palestine who aren't as connected to the identity. And I think it's when that happens more and more, it's a really positive sign.
Yeah. Hey, you know who still hasn't used the word apartheid? The New York Times. All right.
Yeah, that's true. I'll say, for example, that almost at every major media company that I worked, there was overt censorship as well as subtle censorship, which is like can be compounded by self-censorship, and it was never explicitly explained. And that's what was really frustrating. And part of why I chose to leave Vice when I did was just out of frustration with that reality. It wasn't to be some hero and, I'm sacrificing this great, gig because I want to stand up for what's right in Palestine. No, it's like you're censoring my work. You're both sidesing things. You're eliminating settlements, which are such a big part of this. And when I challenge you as to why, it's just deflect. And so it's hard for me to work in that kind of an environment and imagine that I'm going to be doing anything productive.
Vice was like, here's an in-depth look at 7 sex clubs in Israel. It's like, all right, we get it.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that they've made some pretty hard-hitting stuff on Israel and Palestine, but they also censored the hell out of my dog. And so it is what it is.
Yeah, I mean, if you're trying to erase settlements, that's a pretty big part of the problem. It's like, how can you even be doing your job as a journalist to represent the reality?
We stumbled upon this neighborhood in Silwan, and we were going with like some guy who represented like the organizations that would kick Palestinian families out and go through the courts, and the way they did it, and it was very violent. We stumbled upon this scene that was like of Hollywood epic proportions, like a mother with her daughter. She just so happened to be still legally allowed to be in the house, but the 3 other generations in this home, the Al-Nab family, were kicked out. So they're outside. The mother's coming home from school. The Swedish settlers are with their guns in their pockets, like throwing the kids' toys out. It starts pouring down with rain. Like, honestly, like there are some days where like I think back of all the places I've been in the field as a reporter, and that was for a lot of reasons, but it was just like this incredible microcosm of the crisis, the inhumanity, complicity, and the injustice of it all. And it was right there in front of us. Like if we would have spent a lot of money to recreate that in like a short film or a film, we wouldn't have been able to create that scene. And so not only for that scene to have been cut, but it was edited, it was sent to HBO, they loved it, the feedback was great, but then all of a sudden that entire scene disappears, and then the VO. I don't want to harp on Vice. This is like...
Oh, let's talk about it.
No, but like, as in kind of like at a pivotal moment in my career, to be told, yo, dude, the settlements, and this is not a joke, this is verbatim what was said. Dude, the settlements are like crazy. Like, that's why we took the scene out. Because like some people say they're okay. And some people just think like they're like totally, like it was very reductive thinking. Like and it was very convenient, like excuses. Oh, the settlements are crazy. Like, okay, what has Vice ever published that's not crazy? Like, isn't that the guiding editorial policy?
Yeah, right.
But also, real quick, who was providing feedback? My drug dealer?
Yeah.
Dude.
I'll tell you. It wasn't everyone, but there was like one editor in particular who, like, when I confronted him and a couple others, and then like, I ended up recording some lines in VO, but then like changing it, and they ended up using lines that they had written rather than I had written. And it's like my voice and my name at the end. It's not about my brand, or like I wish I had given enough thought to my brand to like protect it. But it was more just like my own sense of like what's right or wrong, and like why I'm a journalist, and like what I'm trying to accomplish. And like for me, it's not about being a journalist or like having a huge paying gig. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't be joining you from here. I'd be in like some flashy studio. But the point is, there's liberation in not being beholden to these power structures that insist on erasing, the Palestinian struggle for dignity and justice. And it's exhausting work, as you guys know. But that's why it's funner when it's a podcast and like we can be more real about it.
Yeah. So let me ask you this: do you feel a little bit like a sigh of relief now that the conversation has shifted so much? I mean, Michael and I, literally every week, we talk about that week's report that declares that Israel's an apartheid state. And there's always like, there's a new one every week,
Yeah.
Like the latest one is the UN Special Rapporteur that was like, yeah, it's apartheid. Yeah. And, obviously before that we had Beit Salem, Human Rights Watch, we had the Harvard Law Clinic, we had, even going back as far as Jimmy Carter, the Amnesty report. I mean, it's like, how many more reports do we need? But also because there's like this sort of avalanche of like people coming out and saying, no, it's apartheid. Yeah. You feel like sort of relieved that now you can kind of maybe be more comfortable in.
Yeah. I think in some ways, what you just described and this momentum and amnesty coming in, and a lot of this on the back of a lot of Palestinian human rights organizations,
Sure.
as well as B'Tselem, and I'm not saying that just to give them a shout out, but what I'm saying is change really comes best from within. And now that you're starting to see other people echoing what Palestinian human rights organizations and others have been saying for a really long time, I think it does change the calculus. And I think on the flip side, it does make it all the more contentious, because it just triggers this, we've seen already, Israel's defense being like, why are you singling out Israel? Why are you not criticizing China? You don't see anyone in the world being like, why are Ukrainians singling out Russia?
Right. For sure.
Calling Israel an apartheid state is really about identifying a perpetrator of systemic human rights violations that match the description of apartheid. And people are like, oh, but it's not exactly like South Africa, so it's not apartheid, or it's, and this whataboutism, it's like, it is a lot more simple than that. If you look at Amnesty's report and all these others, that happens kind of in cycles. If you violate international law, if you deny human rights, you should be held accountable, especially if you do it under imposing a system of apartheid.
100%. And two things in response to that. It matters because the U.S. funds it. The U.S. funds occupation and apartheid in Palestine through the Israeli government and entity. And it also matters because we're Palestinian. So obviously we're going to talk about the thing that is depriving us and our people of rights. Mm-hmm. That's what's relevant to us.
Also, we spoke to Nelson Mandela's grandson, and he said it was an apartheid. So, I would take that over 14-year-old troll accounts on the internet.
Yeah. I mean, I honestly think that, we're in a weird moment where it's impossible for anyone who knows the basics about what's happening in Israel and Palestine to be looking at what's happening between Russia and Ukraine, which is very different, but also very similar, and not come to the conclusion that, there is an insane, and you guys have remarked about it, just in terms of the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, just how much of a knee-jerk reaction there is and how much plotting there is to make that a non-starter when talking about Israel and Palestine. But the whole world, the business community, there's a cultural, economic, political boycott on Russia. People are lining up, falling over themselves, to fall in line with this. And it's really, I think, made it that much harder to ignore sort of when the US and the world kind of chooses to just not pay attention, because that's not helping anybody, right? And so that's why I think this amnesty move, it's just the beginning, but I think the momentum, I think there's reason to be hopeful, cautiously hopeful, but hopeful.
Yeah, I know people who were like, dude, we got to sanction Russia in SWIFT. And it's like, you don't even have a bank account. What are you talking about? Where did you learn this?
Yeah, it's weird, right? It's wild how things become just part of the
you deliver for Uber Eats, bro. This is not your fight. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And what's the purpose? Why these sanctions on Russia? Why is it so in vogue? Is it really about the egregious human rights violations, which Russia is committing, and they've been committing in Syria and throughout the world, and the US is committed. But is it about human rights, or is it just about, it's so convenient because this is really about Western hegemony, and this really serves this narrative of the West and Russia and authoritarianism? But in a lot of ways, the world feels like it's coming undone in a lot of different ways. And I think Israel's role in trying to balance supporting Ukraine, but also completely supporting Russia and Putin's inner circle is also very hard to ignore for anyone who's been kind of looking at Israel's positioning in the world. It's interesting.
So I'm really happy that you brought that up, because that's one of the things I wanted to chat with you about, because you've been tweeting and posting about this quite a bit. And I think it's really interesting, because you're seeing, what was it, a U.S. congressperson come out and say that we should sanction Israel for not taking a harder stance on Russia.
Hey, we'll take the sanctions where we can get them. Fuck it.
Yeah. I mean, I just think it's been wild to witness the president of Ukraine, saying to the Israeli parliament, the threat we face is the same for us and for you. It's the destruction of a people and even a name. I want you to think about this, while he's complaining. And, we've seen, Ukrainian officials reject calls from Israel just this past week. We just saw news today that Israel, is selling their Pegasus spyware, which like can, make any phone completely accessible to you and all the data on that phone.
Oh, our listeners are familiar with spyware.
Yeah, right. Right? Like the most powerful cybersecurity tool, they're not giving it to Ukraine because Russia found out and they're trying to protect Russian targets from Ukraine and Estonia, but they're selling it to like the UAE and Saudi. So,
but also they're supposed to be the mediators of peace talks between Ukraine and Russia, right? Israel is supposed to be like the guy that's like, they were talking about Bennett, like trying to be the mediator between everyone, and it's just a very awkward positioning to
totally
you don't even know what their role is. I mean,
yeah. And I think like a leader of a people, like let's look at it like macro, like a leader of a people under occupation asking the leaders of a government that's been occupying another people for 74 years, like, why aren't you helping us? To me, it's just the ultimate display of like selective empathy for humanity and select, it's so powerful. And I've had a lot of old friends, quite frankly, who are Ukrainian or who really are invested in what's been happening in Russia and Ukraine and are very angry with me. And they seem to see my pointing out these double standards, despite also raising money and attention for what's happening in Ukraine to the Ukrainian people. They kind of see it as like a zero-sum game. It's like mutually exclusive. Like if I'm going to shine light on Israeli hypocrisy, Western hypocrisy, people lining up and congressmen saying boycott, divestment, and sanctions is effective on Russia. Like if I criticize those things, they see that as somehow like I don't believe in the Ukrainian right to like, to resist. And it's
quite the opposite, actually.
Yeah, and it's also quite the opposite, this statement, right? The threat we face is the same, the destruction of a people. Like, I know that's a narrative, but that's not the reality on the ground in Israel and Palestine. Like, so it's crazy. It's wild to see how things can be kind of co-opted. And so I've been trying to, in my own ways, using social media, but also like, yeah, I think it's important and it's incumbent upon all of us, like whether through comedy or podcasts or journalism or what have you, to just kind of like take a moment and be like, well, if you can have this much motivation to do it and you can see it as right, and, then why not in this situation? So.
Yeah, Ukrainians are going hard on anybody who points out that there might be Nazis among their ranks. Yeah. And then if you're not like filling up Molotov cocktails yourself, they're like, you don't care about Ukraine.
Yeah, dude. It's wild. I mean, yeah. I also think, like you saw with Vogue, what happened with Gigi, right?
Sure. She got erased just like our podcast got deleted off the internet.
Exactly. And it was around the same time, I remember. And quite frankly, when your podcast came back up, I took a screenshot and I sent it to like some people I was talking to at the public policy team at Meta or Instagram, because there's just really no explanation for the double standards, and sort of what they explained to me was really interesting, but it was very much like a convenient argument of like, yeah, well, this is inciting violence. Like if you say Palestinians should be free from the river to the sea, you're inciting violence, but you're going to change your hate speech policies so that I can call for the assassination of Russian people, and that's all good. But it's just like, so it's a very odd moment we're living in, where the selectivity on like empathy and dignity and who deserves it is just not just in the Palestinian context. It's just mind blowing, like more than it's ever been.
You spoke to somebody from Meta, Facebook, and they said that like some of the deletion of Palestinian content was due to the content itself?
Yeah. So for example, what they explained to me is like when I would get shadow banned on my stories, when I would be posting about Palestine or I'd see other people doing it, they'd say those are like soft measures where the algorithm is self-correcting, right? So the algorithm is seeing something that is categorized, that it should be deprioritized from people's feeds, from timelines. But then there's this like hard measure, right? Which is where we've seen like just accounts be taken down or suspended. And those largely happen as a result of like violations of the terms, like most often inciting violence. And then we got into this very like meta conversation about, okay, so like I know, and like the reason that Facebook was created is to be an entertainment. It's not about like documenting human rights. I'm like, okay, well, people are using your platforms in this way. So you're saying documenting an Israeli soldier beating a child is inciting violence because I'm documenting an act of violence, but the act of violence itself is going on with impunity. Like, there's no accountability for the act of violence, but the person who reports it on your platform is now going to be held accountable for reporting it. And that's where the conversation went. And so it was very I was left very discombobulated, but also a little bit disheartened because it's important. These platforms and this podcast and the way we can publish, it's so important.
That's extremely interesting because we spoke to representatives from Facebook, Meta, Instagram, whatever they want to call themselves, and they said to us our account wasn't flagged because of our content, that our account disappeared because Lara and I
thought people reported it.
No, they said that it wasn't reported.
Know. We didn't know initially, but then they told us that it was for a different reason, that it was for data scraping.
Yeah, they said, and also, or it was either data scraping or the fact that we had dual logins, so we had logged in at the same time, which triggered us.
I've heard that.
It's
which apparently logging in at the same time is like a feature of data scraping or something.
But data scraping, you mean like an extraction, like you're extracting data.
Well, that's interesting that you say that, Ahmed, because I didn't even know what data scraping was. And when the Meta representative was like, we just found out that your account was deleted for data scraping, I said, I'm so sorry, but I don't know what that is. And I'm certainly not tech savvy enough to be able to do it, and neither is Michael. And so they were like, oh, the algorithm must have just flagged your account for data scraping because you guys have, you were logged in at the same time using the account, and then it just got stuck and it never like reactivated.
But I'm assuming data scraping is like when you use those like third-party tools to like up your followers or do automatic things.
Yeah, we don't do any of that.
Yeah, the only
obviously, like we didn't buy followers. Like we have organic followers.
No. I mean, I don't know. I've heard so many different excuses be given for as to why things disappear or things don't populate or things get flagged with like a protective like warning or
right.
And I guess it's better to be in on the conversation with them than just to be like, but I appreciate.
Yeah, I prefer they lie to my face. That's what I like. I don't like to hear it from behind.
Just being lied to.
Well,
no, they reached out. Like I tweeted, they reached out, which felt like anyway. I think.
Well, thank you.
I think it really highlights the need for like people, and that's why there's some initiatives within Palestine I think are so critical, where they're like actually documenting these sort of things, like when it happened after the summer. And there's a lot of like, it's easy to feel, and God knows I've felt this way in the past, that it's futile to even take a screenshot or write something up about it or complain, because it can feel, just to use the David and Goliath thing, like you're up against these like people with incredible resources, and who are you? And but that's how you lose, and that's how you get silenced, and that's how you get censored. And so
well, I will tell you, Ahmed, I don't think it is futile at all, because we know for a fact that the reason why the Instagram person was able to work to reinstate our account was because, in parallel to us working through Palestine Legal to get their attention at Meta, the Instagram person had actually seen on Instagram our complaints about our account being deleted from our own personal accounts. And, the sort of campaign that we had launched with, our followers tagging Instagram and saying, bring back the Palestine pod and all of this. I do think that, these companies are enormous, and it's like the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. And then there's like thousands of people that work for them. And so you talk to someone, you get an explanation, you talk to someone else, you get a different explanation. And it's probably a little bit of everything, but also definitely censorship of Palestinian content. And like, maybe there are technical issues as well, but everything combined.
Let's not forget, just for context, social media platforms are profit-making entities. They're vulnerable to different kinds of political pressure, and we've seen like former police chiefs who have been, work in Israel now on the board that's supposed to do oversight for Facebook. I mean, there are conflicts of interest, but I think the Palestinian issue really gets to the heart of censorship on social media platforms in such a powerful way that, in a way, it's an opportunity when these things happen. when the Kurds and others and activists on the ground gain such a big following, and that you can tell that there's a hunger out there, and then we see the censorship start happening, and then there's pushback from within the companies, even from Jewish employees, and then there's like, you know, unity, and there's this happening in Israel while this is happening in the States. Like, you know, these things are really disheartening. They're exhausting to constantly be up against, and when they happen to you, they're frustrating, like I'm sure you can attest to. But you know, when we see like hundreds of employees at like Google and Apple calling on their respective CEOs to condemn the violence, and like writing these, you know, hundreds of Facebook employees with this internal letter to stop censoring Palestinian voices, that petition that I'm referring to, just for example, like was enough to force Instagram to actually make slight changes to their algorithm. These ideas of words like martyr and resistance in Arabic or in English, which are used in reference to the Palestinian struggle, were deemed incitements to violence according to the algorithm, like from an AI perspective, from what I understood. And so that was changed. Content relating to anything related to Al-Aqsa, you know,
Right.
was flagged. And that's so inherently problematic when that's exactly what Israel was doing before the whole Gaza war thing, which is like very like palatable for the media. They were doing all this other stuff which was being censored. So, you know, I think it's always easy to like lament how big these companies are, and also like how big Israel is, and how big the lobby that keeps Zionism in power is in Congress. And I hate to speak so freely, but like on the flip side, it's encouraging to see the small wins. I think they should be celebrated.
Oh, man, there's so much here. And, you know, one of the things we told the representatives that we had a Zoom call with was that you do not have the trust of the user. It's really, you know, yeah, it's really great that today you're coming to me with an excuse about data scraping, and you're talking about like how like the algorithm is faulty and you're making changes and you're working to better it. But just as you said, Ahmed, like we all read the same reports from, you know, Politico and The Intercept and other news organizations that talk about, you know, partnerships with the Israeli government, and you know, the placement of like high level Israeli government officials, former government officials on the censorship board, you know, of Meta. And they came back to us and they were like, well, you know, let's just let's just take it step by step. And, you know, with respect to that, yes, it's true that we do have channels of communication open with the Israeli government, but we also have channels of communication open with all governments. It's just that the Israeli government is doing the work of the Zionist activists, whereas the PA is not doing the work of Palestinian activists. So they told me, they were like, well, now we're working to build these relationships with the grassroots, and like talking to you guys as part of that as well, to see how we can do better. And I'm like, great, like let's just, and I would love to see it.
There's a lot to be said about that, though. Like, you know, they say it and it can sound like an excuse, but like there's no secret that the Israeli government has an entire operation where they flag so much content. And that's why, like, you know, Facebook complies with like 95%, I think, of Israeli requests for like content to be taken down because of like their defense when I brought that up to them. And you know, there's some truth to it, is like, well, if Israel's flagging like infinitely more content than any other government, and you're operating at 95%, like, you know, then that's a lot of content that's being censored, right? And to your point, like when trust in social media companies is so low, and all sides of the political spectrum are kind of finding faults in how these companies handle user content. What is the purpose behind these companies at the end of the day? How do they see themselves? What is their purpose? What's their function? The fact that major platforms like Instagram had to publicly confirm their bias in the algorithm when it comes to Israel and Palestine, and that we saw, like you said, The Intercept like obtained that secret Facebook memo that they talked about how the term Zionist was moderated. I think it's important this stuff comes out. So like no longer is there content like, you know, this idea of pressuring like the New York Times or like the Israel PR machine being so powerful. I don't think it is as powerful as it once was. And I think in a lot of ways Ukraine is helping kind of point that out.
Yeah, they're in utter and complete disarray every day. It used to be we felt we were on the ropes. We'd wake up, you know, our account would be blah, blah, like, you know, just somebody else, some news story broke. But now every day they have meltdowns and we get to witness it. Speaking specifically about our account, though, their excuse that we logged in at the exact same time makes zero sense, because Lara and I were on completely different time zones. I was in Thailand She was in the United States. We were barely awake at the same time. You know what I mean? It makes
we barely could record a podcast at the same time. Like every time was like inconvenient for both of us.
We had to schedule it like days in advance. So there is literally no chance we were both on the same social at the same time.
But even if we were, we're not the only people to have a social media page that's managed by multiple people. That's not unique to us, And it to me, it felt like there was something really faulty with their process. Like, okay, if it is for this technical reason, then there's something wrong with your company because it's flagging the wrong thing. And if it is not because it's, just a technical error, and if it is for content reasons, well, then there's something wrong with your company because you're censoring content that should not be censored, that people have a right to know about. And, to your point, Ahmed, the thing that is absolutely insane, and that I told the Electronic Intifada in an article that's hopefully coming out soon, is that surely Instagram's policies about violence and hate speech cannot be intended to censor victims of violence and hate speech from sharing what is happening to them. There is a difference between calling for violence and using hate speech and saying, hi, this is happening to me, and I am sharing what is happening to me.
Well, I think, and again, that's ideally true, but I can tell you that in my experience in the media context, I don't know that that's true. There's been a criminalization of Palestinians' right to demand their right to live in freedom and dignity. Because this whole thing of from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. If you listen to those words, at no point does it discuss Jewish people, Israel, Zionism, any of these sensitive terminologies, which of course I understand where the sensitivities come from. But the way it's tossed around, the way in which people fire people for using that term, when Bella Hadid sang it back in the summer, how polarizing that was. And why is that? It's because there's this perception that if you're calling for Palestinians to be free human beings or to live a life of dignity, basic human rights, then that's somehow anti-Semitic or erasing Israel or calling for the destruction of Israel. Like the way in which over decades that those equations have been implied strategically and effectively, I think has bled into the algorithms, the way in which they're defended. I don't know if I'm making sense. I know it might seem like a small point, but yeah, I mean, we've seen time and time again how people have been demonized and lost a lot of things just for simply focusing.
I think it definitely makes sense. And I think, back on this point of, well, who decides what resistance is legitimate?
Right.
And is it international law? Because if it is international law, then Palestinians have a right to resist a military occupation under international law. That's what international law says. So if it's not international law, then what standards are we applying? And are they arbitrary subjective standards that are just sort of like the whims of the creators of these apps and the forces that they work with? I would argue that we should be guided by international law, because that's what the world has agreed is the relevant standard in this situation. Occupation is a product of international law. It is a creature of international law, and the rules surrounding it, and when it's legal and when it's illegal, and what you can do to resist it. This is all within the scheme of international law. So that's why it matters that Palestinian resistance is criminalized and Ukrainian resistance is celebrated and encouraged, because in both scenarios, under international law, these people have a right to resist.
Yeah, I think what's so, quite frankly, painful, what drives me the most mad is this idea that if you advocate for Palestinian rights in any context, you are guaranteed to be questioned, right? But it's not just that they're celebrating and encouraging resistance in Ukraine. It's the willingness and the speed with which they glorify it. And I don't know if it's just about the narrative of Russia versus the West, Western hegemony, or if that they're white people. I mean, I think there's a lot of compounding factors, but again, that's why I think whether it's Palestine, Kashmir, Yemen, Syria, there's so many groups of people who now, because of what's happening in Ukraine, it's just that much more glaring how little the world pays attention to or let alone holds them accountable or like, takes swift actions to like sanction them. So yeah, it's exhausting. And I think it's a very peculiar moment, like in the human rights space. Like I think it's gonna be a milestone.
I think the lesson we've learned is that if you want to resist occupation, first be white, and secondly, be civilized. So when you're throwing your Molotov cocktail, keep a pinky up. That's just
like a champagne.
Yes.
If we think of what is the purpose, like here's a question to entertain. What's the purpose of Israel's system of apartheid? Like, why does it exist? And I think
a question that is not asked often enough.
Yeah, because I think, apartheid is pretty shitty for everyone involved. Obviously, like different for the victim versus the perpetrator, but to me, it's very simple. The intent is to maintain Jewish hegemony, demographic hegemony. And that is what you could describe the Zionist movement to be, right? And they focus very much on this idea of achieving a Jewish majority and maximum control of the land. And so if the intent is maintained, if that intent is maintained through systematic human rights violations, which, as you said, under international law, that's including like forcibly removing people, displacement, and all these other coercive environments, like it's very simple, if you look at it in that lens. Unfortunately, for all the reasons we've all talked about, this kind of system of oppression and domination that's so obvious if you're on the ground, and to us and to many others, which Amnesty and many other human rights organizations has said amounts to apartheid. It's very simple and very obvious. It's just, that's what makes it so frustrating.
You remember when Ned Price was asked, what about Palestinians? Do they have a right to resist? And he just kind of like bumbled and was like, the situation is evolving very quickly. And he wouldn't flat out say that Palestinians have a right to resist. And you contrast that with the exact same scene, but I think what is her name? Jen something?
Psaki,
yeah, exactly. Where she's being asked about, what is the U.S. position on Ukrainian resistance, and she's there like, well, we are with them, and we are honoring their bravery, and we love them, and we are supporting them. And it's like, the law is not different, people. Yeah. Like, why does Ned Price say the situation is evolving? And I don't want to make any comments about an evolving situation. That doesn't mean anything. It's just an answer that doesn't mean anything, And it just, to me, it's like, yes, double standards, yes, hypocrisy, all of that. But it's also just the arbitrariness with which you are going to actually apply the law. And if the law is applied in an arbitrary manner, then you don't have a system of law at all. You just have total chaos.
Well, and not that it's a law, but just to take another example and circle back, like we're looking at Facebook changing its laws, right? The laws that govern its platform, like its terms of changing hate speech in the context of Russia and Ukraine to tolerate hate speech against Russians, to call for their assassination. I mean, I don't want to keep beleaguering the point, but like it speaks to the exact point you were making. Like they're treating this context and Russia invading Ukraine and occupying parts of Ukraine, and and they're treating it in such a different way for many reasons that it do involve how international laws are treated, and how we treat people who have brown skin or white skin when they choose to resist. And so I always wonder, like, okay, sometimes I'm in the shower, I'm like, okay, so let's assume Russia actually took control of Ukraine, like they started the occupation, it's a full occupation of the country. Very unlikely, let's hope that happens. But if that were to happen, like, because the world's still gonna hold Russia accountable, they're still gonna like try to increase these sanctions. It's just like Ukraine and Russia is not the same as Israel and Palestine, obviously. But to distract from where there are similarities and how the reaction is so different despite those similarities, I think it's just like what that guy, I think I included it in one of my posts, like some random dude on Twitter was like, people who hear like genocide of Jews when what was said was freedom for Palestinians are really just telling on themselves. Like, it's because it's like not everybody's idea of freedom, and I'm sorry if I'm speaking too casually, but like involves the expulsion or ethnic cleansing or extermination, whatever word you want to use, of another group of people. Obviously that becomes sensitive because of the tragedy of the Holocaust. But to pretend that tragedy is not factoring into the discourse in Ukraine and Russia, I think is also a disservice. And so it's just really disheartening that these cycles of violence continue. Like, what else can you say?
I also think about Russia in the shower.
Oh my God, that means a lot to me that you admitted that, even if you're making it up. Because I'm like, why am I like?
I'll just be scrubbing away. You know what I mean? I'm like, Putin's having trouble holding territory.
His strategy is flawed. Or like Hillary Clinton, like tweeting, like, if Russian leadership would rather not be accused of committing war crimes, they should stop bombing hospitals. I mean, really? Like, it's like, just... It's too easy, you know?
It's nice that she could take time away from creating a slave market in Libya to say that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, she's trying to, you know, diversify. As the Saudis are
took her foot off Haiti's neck for a second.
Yeah, man.
Well, I feel like this is my favorite Palestine. By the way, have you guys had politicians on? No.
We had Nkosi Mandela.
Okay.
So... yeah, is South African politician.
Yeah,
but other than that, no.
I was thinking about reaching out to Richard Boyd. He had a video in like the Irish Congress.
Oh yeah, that one that went sort of viral a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, he'd be great. He always is fiery. And I asked just because I was listening to The Daily, which I never do, but I was because there was a special on Rashida Tlaib, and I sometimes like don't realize how, I don't know, like her situation must be really tough. Like I'm just trying to empathize with her reality, because you know we all live it in a version. Even you, I'm sure, in France, like, I don't know, it's like, you know, people are prejudiced in all sorts of situations, or they have preconceived notions of what it means to be Palestinian, what the, you know, you have to wear it. But yeah, I just thought it'd be cool if you had someone like her on.
Oh, I would love to have her on.
I feel like
we would love to have her on if you know her.
I'm sure she's a fan of the pod, you know?
Feel free to connect us. We would love to.
One day, I'm sure you will have her on, because she keeps it real. I've had her on. Yeah. Did like an Instagram thing with her once, and once interviewed her at HA, and she's just so real. Which is nice.
I think it's cool to see just so many new Palestinian like leaders and visionaries.
So many different fields.
In so many different fields. And there is something really inspiring about like this generation of Palestinians that are in the grassroots. We're separate from our, you know, government, or, you know, in Palestine, if you can even call it government, right?
Yeah.
But we've kind of just like said, fuck it. And everybody's doing their own thing, whether they're in Palestine or abroad, and making waves, like creating spaces for us. And I think it's really cool. And I think one of the coolest things, you were talking about Mohammed Al-Kurd, one of the coolest things about him is that he shows you that you can be 100% unapologetic, but also not separate from spaces like the UN.
Yeah.
Like, to me, that was so perfect, because it was like, he is an activist in the rawest sense, because he's literally defending his house with his body.
But that's where that's where I think him and Muna, I really hate to like attribute so much attention to them in this.
Same, but yeah,
in the moment of this summer. But the reason I do it is because it's impossible to deny like the just this, whatever you want to call it, serendipity, the circumstances with which their platforms were being like megaphones for weeks on end. And it's not just them, you know, it's nodes, right? To your point. But they were central nodes, one in English, one in Arabic. And she's as eloquent in Arabic as he is in English. And they're twins. And I think it's, you know, everyone loves like that kind of a story.
Yeah, everybody loves a twin story.
Everyone loves a twin story. Like, where's my twin? Yeah, no, I mean, I'm not going to lie. Like, I remember watching Muhammad and then watching Mona and then like being called by Euronews and then like getting ready. But like, I think my dog had just died. So I was like in a really dark place already. And I was like mourning her loss. And then Palestine happened. And then I just like, when I went live, I was like, you know what? I'm just going to do what they did. Like, I'm just not going to hold back. And like, you know, sometimes when you're in alignment whether it's inspired by other people or not, hit a right zone and you connect, and I think what you're describing is, there's so many grassroots people connecting with other people, new audiences connecting with each other, and it's encouraging.
It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, it really is.
And just an observation about Mohammed El-Kurd at the UN and sort of like the double standards that exist when we're talking about Ukraine versus Palestine. The outfit that Mohammed El-Kurd chose to wear, he wore like a leather jacket, no tie, and was wildly criticized by talking heads on literally every station. But then Zelensky shows up to talk in a tracksuit and everybody's like, what a superstar this guy is. He keeps it real. You know what I'm saying? It's like
he keeps it so real that when he got his vaccination, he felt the need to take off his entire shirt and just like flex while he was getting vaccinated.
You got to give him the gun show, even when you're getting guns sent to you by the U.S.
Yeah, no, Muhammad definitely rolled into the UN, and I would say gave them the respect they deserve. He was very nonchalant, unimpressed, and I'm just here.
Why should he be impressed?
But
why should he be impressed? Like they are so central to.
That's what these institutions like. That's how they define themselves, right? It's all about that
prestige.
Prestige,
pomp and circumstance.
Pomp and circumstance. He just walked in there, and I forget what the like snarky remark was.
He was like, "Thank you for your very impassioned speeches. I'm sure the occupation is quivering in its boots right now."
That's what it was.
That's what it was. And then he just continued without like even a beat. It was so brilliant.
Yeah, he's so dope.
Yeah, he knows what's up. He's doing it right, I think.
Well, send him our best wishes. I'd love to see what you're doing now and what you're going to keep doing. I think it's a good place to end, Michael, unless you have any last minute thoughts.
Totally. Tell him about the podcast. We'd love to have him.
I will.
That's another episode of the Palestine Pod. Thank you all so much for listening. Thank you so much to our guest, Ahmed. Appreciate your stories, your perspective, all the work that you're doing. And we thank you so much to our listeners. Go ahead and check us out, www.palestinepod.com. We will upload our sources expeditiously as best we can. And check us out on Instagram. I'm not going to do the whole Instagram. Instagram is
at Instagram.com.
Yeah. You guys know what the HTTP is.
You guys know how to get there, right?
The Palestine Pod on Instagram. Send us an email at palestinepod@gmail.com and find us on Patreon, www.patreon.com/PalestinePod. That's been another episode of the Palestine Pod. Thank you all so much for listening. Have a great day. Palestine Pod.